Good evening, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. We'll just wait for a few moments while people gather. Such a beautiful day, beautiful night. I'm flattered that you're here with us tonight. Thank you, appreciate that. All right, I think in the interest of time, we'll get started and people can filter in if need be. Good evening, my name is Kelly Greenlee. I am the Community Outreach Librarian at Prince Memorial Library. I'm very happy to be here tonight. This is an exciting program. I think all of our programs are exciting, so there's that. But I'm very happy to offer this particular one because I have a particular interest in the topic. So before we start, I just want to call your attention to the bottom of your screen. You may have to wiggle your mouse or move your mouse a little bit. You'll find at the bottom of your screen there is an icon that says Q&A. So our format this evening will be that we will have our presentation and then we will be happy to answer questions at the end. So if at any time during the presentation you have a question you would like to ask, you can click on that icon at the bottom of your screen and a little box will pop up and you can enter your question there and we will do our best to answer all of the questions before the end of the evening. So I hope that was clear. Let's see, we can begin. So I used to live in a place slightly south of here, and March 17th, which was St. Patrick's Day, was the day that you planted peas. And I think it's possible that that is the same here, although maybe it's Patriots Day. Somebody will probably inform me of that by the Q&A, feel free. But I think maybe it's Patriots Day. So anyway, very soon, we will all be digging our hands into the earth. And when you do that, and even now, I hope that you will offer a thought of gratitude to the Wabanaki people who for hundreds of years have worked and cared for and played on this land that we call home. So it's time to introduce our presenter for the evening. Eric Topper is the Director of Education for Maine Audubon. He is lucky enough to call his workplace Gilsland Farm, which is one of my happy places. So I'm going to let Eric do most of his own introduction, quite honestly, and I'm going to pass the baton to him. Welcome, Eric. Thank you.
Nice. Thank you, Kelly, for having me. And thank you all for tuning in tonight to this program. Always fun for me to have a busy Zoom room all to myself. So thank you all for tuning in. I'm going to go ahead and share a screen here. Give me a second. I should be smoother at this by now. Okay, so hopefully you're seeing my presentation. So again, my name is Eric Topper. I'm the Director of Education at Maine Audubon. For those not familiar with Maine Audubon, here is our organization's mission. We are here in a phrase to conserve Maine's wildlife and wildlife habitat. That is our overarching job. That mission will be pervasive throughout tonight's presentation as I try to get you all thinking about this incredible place that Kelly has rightly acknowledged, the Wabanaki people, that we share in stewardship of that land now. I am here to talk about one specific component of conserving wildlife and wildlife habitat here in Maine, and that is a program we call Bringing Nature Home. which is a program of Maine Audubon. The background of that project starts with a book of that very same title. That book is available on loan at the library as we speak. The book was written by an entomologist, a person who studies insects named Doug Tallamy, who's an entomologist at the University of Delaware. And while all of his colleagues were jetting off through the research years to these exciting foreign locations where there are insects as big as your face to study, he instead stayed in the mid-Atlantic and in his own subdivision and explored the insect life around him in the landscape with which he was most familiar, in particular the Lepidoptera, the butterflies and moths. And we'll talk a lot about butterflies and moths in landscapes like the one that Doug Tallamy did his research and where most of us live. The program was also brought to us, started by friends of Maine Audubon and now a board member of Maine Audubon's, Jim and Ann Hancock, are proud products of the industry that I'm going to spend the next 40 minutes railing against, the horticulture industry, which is the industry that has unknowingly and unwittingly transformed major portions of our landscape, and including things like what Jim Hancock is famous for and paid for is genetically modifying blueberries to become a source of people food all over the world. Blueberries, as many of you know, are a great plant to grow if you're in an arid landscape. There are increasingly parts of our planet that are becoming arid landscapes and more and more people residing there. And so blueberries are a great crop to take around the world and develop agriculturally, commercially, et cetera. Audubon at Home, for those of you familiar with National Audubon, an organization that we're not actually directly connected to at Maine Audubon, but National Audubon had a program around conserving bird habitat in communities called Audubon at Home. So we kind of channeled some of that old work. And then another organization that I'm going to talk a little bit about tonight and hopefully will introduce you to is the Wild Seed Project, which is a Maine-based organization focused on the propagation from seed primarily of Maine native plants. So we'll talk about that towards the end. So this project, this Bringing Nature Home project that you just got the background on, this is really kind of about this different sort of way to look out the window. And this was, I think, a project was really, the idea was really well summarized by a landscape architect by the name of Thomas Rayner, who introduced this idea of this kind of threefold way to look at and evaluate the landscape around us. And we're really good, I think most of us, especially in our communities, at the second two, but this hopefully we'll get a better sense of this first one, the ecological function of that place around us. The landscape function is what it does for us. You know, that's if you're like me and your landscape has to have a place for the kids to kick soccer balls around and a place for those kids when they get too hot to go sit in the shade. And all of those things are what my landscape has to do for me. That's the landscape function. And then the social cultural function, which Kelly again introduced well, is our historical connection to the land, our cultural connection to the land, our social connection to the land. What should the space outside the library be doing for our community? Do we gather there? Do we have concerts there? You know, that sort of thing. So looking at the landscape around us, and that can be simple or tricky depending on how you view things. In a place like Maine, the good news in a place like Maine is I can talk to anybody in the state of Maine and I can share the same fact that there was an over 90% chance that historically the landscape that you're sitting in now looked like this. It looked like some version of this mixed hardwood successional, somewhere in succession forest. You can see their pine trunks in there. You can see their different widths. This forest has definitely been logged and cut over, but it's definitely coming back. This is, again, what over 90% of Maine's landscape has looked like historically. The other, 3 to 7%, depending on which study you look at, was wetland or alpine zone, or a place that used to look like this, but a forest fire or a wind event blew everything down, and now it's kind of coming back. But a huge portion of the landscape used to look like this. And so this is the ecological function that most of us need to replace. This is in direct conflict with those other two criteria, the landscape function. This is a great place to have outside of your yard, and to look at, but it's not a great place to kick a soccer ball around. It's not a great place to set up a couple lawn chairs and have a couple of lemonades, unless you want those lemonades full of, critters that are going to fly into that sweet smelling, so it doesn't, and it's not a really great place for us to gather and have that concert and do that poetry reading or whatever else to do. And so that puts us at a little bit of odds or potential where, and that's helped us get to this place where we are now, where we're sort of deciding, well, the habitat should be out there in the other places in Maine, and where the people live is not habitat anymore. Well, that's a problem, because we're not going to get back to that 90%. And the losers in all of that are these guys. I use this species, which is not a particularly forest loving species. These are barn swallows, but I use them because any day now, I'm going to drive on the driveway here at Gilsland Farm, and the barn swallows are going to be back. They're heading this direction as we speak. They're migrating here. They are a pretty great early sign of spring, not as great as the red-winged blackbirds, which just got back here literally 2 days ago. But all of these birds are coming back to Maine because that's what Maine has historically done. This landscape has made baby birds for millennia. Birds travel here from hundreds and thousands of miles from all over the world in order to do one thing, and that's find a mate and build a nest and have babies and procreate the species. And to do that, and then to get those babies healthy and fat and strong enough so that they can migrate back to wherever they're going to spend the winter. Or they're going to have babies that are going to have to be fit and strong and smart enough to hunker down, because they're a year-round species. Either way, summers in Maine, that 90+% of mixed forest habitat was making baby birds. And that's what we're losing when we give up on the habitat where we are now. When we have acres and acres of developed landscape in places like Cumberland, that means that we have potentially lost value for the baby birds, or for those migrating birds. Those migrating birds are still programmed to fly over Cumberland and look for those forests and that other habitat that used to be there. And it's not there anymore unless we're paying attention. So if we're going to manage for baby birds, like the birds are counting on us, we need to think about the ecologists and how they approach this work. And this is how they do it. They're thinking about what the animals need, what constitutes habitat, right? And what habitat can we rebuild? What species are we targeting, right? We have to identify some species that we really want to work for and do things for, in the hopes that we can actually get the reward of seeing those species benefit, right? We don't want to manage for penguins in Cumberland because we're not going to be successful, because they're not going to come, and we're going to give up and we're going to think conservation doesn't work. So we want to pick a good species. And then the other thing is, are we doing this in a landscape that's full of other threats that we're going to create breeding habitat, and all these babies are not going to do well in the landscape once they fledge or hit adulthood? So what I offer is the first species that we'll look at tonight is who we could think about managing for in landscapes like Cumberland. And everybody should identify this critter. This is a monarch butterfly. And what most people don't know is this is the monarch butterflies, an illustration of the monarch butterflies migration map. And this is really critical to understanding what our landscapes, what role does our landscape not only play for the critter when it's here, but for the population of this species, right? And this, again, this is the monarch butterfly range map, migration map. You see right around this time of year, March 16th, March 17th or so, the monarchs that have overwintered in the very bottom of the screen in the mountains of Mexico, in the fir forests of Mexico. Those monarchs are going to start kind of waking back up, shaking off the cobwebs from a winter of just kind of being still and being huddled together. And they're going to start looking for sources of nectar. They need sweet, sugary nectar that is produced by blooming flowers. Again, that's the flower, the plant life cycle starts with the flower bloom. That's sexual reproduction for plants. And so the monarchs also want to drink that nectar, which is a trick for the flower to also get pollen all over those butterflies so that the butterfly takes the pollen with them when they go to the next flower to drink nectar. So that's the pollination. But the monarchs are going to start doing that, start pollinating the forests or the lowlands of Mexico. And they're going to be looking for any old flower that will produce nectar, but they're also going to be looking for one genus of plant, the Asclepias genus, which is their specialist host plant, so that they can find a mate, they can impregnate a female, and that female will only lay eggs on the bottom of an Asclepias plant, because she knows that the only plant that her caterpillars can eat and survive are plants in the milkweed genus. And so this yellow, and what'll happen is those eggs get laid, the caterpillars eat the leaves, the caterpillars form a chrysalis, and then the caterpillars fly off. And what you're seeing is those different color arrows are the different generations working their way north as the summer continues. So generation one the butterflies will emerge from chrysalises in April or so, and that generation will work the population a little farther north. They will be looking for milkweed that is coming of age in Texas in the, for us, kind of the early mid-spring, so April, May. And then the butterflies that emerge there will continue, and they'll be hitting the upper Midwest. And those butterflies will be the third or fourth generation, and those will be the ones that end up in Maine in late summer. So monarchs, peak abundance for monarchs in Maine is mid-August through mid-October. So it's not really a summer species here. It's more of a back to school species, and more on that in a minute. And so those monarchs, again, third generation or so, will end up here in Maine. And those are the ones that we will host here. And so that's what that looks like in Portland, Maine, is July or so. When you're looking out, this is my backyard in Portland, Maine. My son and I were trying to manage for monarch butterflies over the course of a couple of years. We got excited when we saw monarchs come back, and we got even more excited when we saw monarchs doing this in our backyard, which was, could be characterized as the birds and the bees of butterflies. These two monarchs are mating. They happen to be on the flower of a native wildflower, Joe Pye weed, but they don't care about that at all. They don't care if that's an invasive species or an exotic species, as long as it's making nectar and as long as it is attractive to a butterfly that the butterfly might also be attracted to, then that's the perfect flower to be on, regardless of where it came from. Because those monarch butterflies are going to be looking for a place to do this when that female became impregnated. So we were looking around, we saw the butterflies, we saw butterfly mating, and we thought that's really great. But now all we have to do is look at one genus of plants in our whole yard. We can forget about everything else that's there, and we should go start turning over the leaves of the milkweed plants in our yard, because we might find one of these little buggers, a monarch butterfly egg on the base of a milkweed plant in my yard in Portland. And you watch that egg for a while, now that you know where the egg is, and you keep going back, and one day you find this. You find the egg sac here empty. And this little guy's come out of that egg. That's the first instar, a little baby monarch caterpillar that just came out of the egg. For context, this is a common milkweed leaf, and this is probably about a ½ inch between these two veins. And so you can see that's just a tiny little guy. An even bigger, a better reference for scale. This is the caterpillar, a different caterpillar, different species of milkweed. And these are not giant thumbs. These are regular old thumbs for context for that size. And so now you're watching monarch caterpillars. Again, you can just keep going back to that same plant because that caterpillar is never going to leave that food source as a caterpillar, except when they're done being a caterpillar, which we'll talk about. But you can see this caterpillar is still really small. So this is a swamp milkweed plant, a different species of native milkweed. So this leaf is probably an inch wide at its widest. And so this caterpillar is still not even as long as the leaf is, half as, you get what I mean. It's not as long as half as of the width of the leaf. And you can keep watching, and that caterpillar phase in Maine will last about 2 weeks. And it'll start getting to the point where those caterpillars are actually pretty good size. So you can see this is not a giant hand or a tiny hand. This is an average size hand, and that caterpillar is as long as that hand is wide. And then you start noticing, if you're watching closely, you start at the end of that second week, you start to see behavioral changes. The caterpillars are spending much less time chomping away at the edges of those leaves and making holes in them, and much more time kind of lounging in the sun, hanging out in the middle of the leaf. And that's because this caterpillar, if you know the life cycle, what is going on in the mind of this critter and what's about to happen is pretty amazing. That this thing is going to go through metamorphosis, which we can't even begin to understand. But that's the time when you start to see caterpillars, if you're watching closely, on non-milkweed plants, because that is likely a defense mechanism for monarch caterpillars. Is when you're getting ready to pupate, when you're done eating, you probably want to ditch the mama plant, because otherwise predators will just learn to hang around when they want a chrysalis snack. And you also probably don't want to give away that really productive plant that got you to this phase. So you want to get away from it. But this is the only time you see caterpillars away from milkweed, is when they're looking for a spot to make a chrysalis. And monarch caterpillars are super fun to watch because they do this telltale hanging J when they find a nice stable platform. They make a little patch of saliva for their back feet. They hang from it. Each J is kind of more distinctive. This one's really curly. Some are kind of straight down and crooked at the end, but this is where they're going to go through. They're going to what's called pupate. And this is where butterflies and moths are a little bit different in most cases. So a monarch is a butterfly, and butterflies in most cases come from a chrysalis. And in most cases, a chrysalis is formed from inside the caterpillar. So this caterpillar will literally turn inside out, and a chrysalis will emerge from within it. That's different than most moths, which will pupate instead of forming a chrysalis from within themselves. They will construct a cocoon around themselves, and then they will go through metamorphosis inside of that cocoon. So that's a kind of cool difference between butterflies and moths. But in the case of the monarch, this chrysalis is going to form, literally this thing is going to turn inside out, and this chrysalis will be there. This is that same exact spot. And if you look really closely at this site, often you will find the shed skin, that distinctive striped skin, white, yellow, and black skin, crumpled up underneath this chrysalis. It literally shed the skin, and you can find it underneath there. So that chrysalis will be there. And this is when they're really, really well camouflaged. It's much easier to find a hanging jay than it is to find a chrysalis. And so this is one of those things when you have your 10-year-old follow the caterpillars around once they leave the milkweed. And once they see them go into the hanging jay, you know where that chrysalis is going to be, which is handy. And if you watch that chrysalis for a couple of weeks, again, usually a 2-week phase for the chrysalis phase as well for monarchs, you watch and you start to see the signs of metamorphosis and the change that's happening inside of that clear exterior. You start to see the wing patterns of the monarch butterfly. And really late in that phase, you start to see a lot more signs of the monarch, definitely that wing. You can see those white spots that line adult monarch's abdomen. You can see the monarch face here and the antennae straightened out. And if you have a 10-year-old and an iPhone, oh no, you don't have that tonight, sorry. But that chrysalis, when that monarch is ready, that chrysalis is going to open up and that monarch will come right out of that chrysalis. And this is a very early shot right after emergent. You can see these wings are not wet. They look like that, but they're actually really dry and powdery, just like the adult wings. They're crinkled like that because they've been mashed into that chrysalis, and the monarch's going to have to slowly pump blood to the cartilage in those wings to stiffen them up so that they can fly. So this is a really vulnerable phase for the monarch to get those until it gets those wings stiffened up. And then you can see this monarch also emerged with a new mouth. It went to sleep with these jaws that worked on the side and chewed on the edge of the leaves. And now it has a straw that's about 1.5 times the length of its body. And you'll see that with newly emerged monarchs slowly unfurling their proboscis, practicing with that new eating apparatus. And when that monarch, once that monarch, and this is that very same butterfly that was filmed in emerging in my living room, and then we moved it right back out to a flower. It happens to be its host plant flower, although it doesn't care anymore. This is a swamp milkweed bloom, and you can see it's actually practicing nectaring with its brand new mouth, trying to suck nectar out of that flower. And its wings are now stiffened up. They're ready to go. All this monarch needs is one 10-year-old being too loud and too close, and it's ready to fly off. And what's significant about that, watching that whole life cycle in a place like Portland, where we watched it and filmed it, was again referring back to that migration map, because this is us in Maine in August, September, October, but we know that the monarchs that emerge here, the adult butterflies that were raised on the milkweed in Maine, those butterflies are actually going to live 5 times as long as their parents or their grandparents or their great-grandparents, and they're going to fly 5 times as far as they did too, because these are the monarchs that are going to be that red arrow. These are the ones that the monarchs in Maine that emerge in Maine are the ones that migrate all the way to Mexico, go to sleep in the fir trees in the mountains of Mexico, and are the ones that are going to wake up next March and going to start this whole thing again. So our monarchs in Maine have to be smarter, fitter, stronger than the generations before them, right? Because these are the ones that it's often referred to as the super generation. And so the timing, this is where, back to timing, you can't just do it with milkweed, because the milkweed, if you're paying attention and you've grown milkweed in Maine, you know that it doesn't bloom in September and October when all these monarchs are flying around. The milkweeds here bloom much sooner than that, July, maybe August. And so, but realize that the monarchs that emerge here, the ones that come out of a chrysalis, have gotten all the milkweed they needed as caterpillars. Now they need nectar. They need sources of nectar all over the landscape because they have a massive trip that they need to make. And so it's not the milkweeds that they're dependent on, it's the New England plants like these New England asters that bloom in September and October, because that's the other monarch food that we need. We need the milkweed for the caterpillars, but we also need late sources of nectar. And that's a critical component. We have to do it all. The timing matters. And it doesn't just matter for monarchs. Those monarchs that are going to emerge in Maine in September, for example, are going to be sharing a landscape with butterflies like this great spangled fritillary. You can tell by looking at this guy's wings that this butterfly has spent a summertime evading predators, getting stuck in this fence and ripping its wings up, but it's already done its thing. It's already mated, and the female has already laid eggs on violets if they can find them, because those caterpillars are going to win her over, and those fritillaries are going to be in early spring in our landscape. And they're sharing a fall landscape with this monarch that just emerged and is eating its first nectar. Again, this monarch is getting ready. They're sharing a flower, one to overwinter or die rather, and the other to just get going and fly 3,500 miles. And so all of this management that we do, if we manage for monarchs and we do the host plant, we have milkweed so that the caterpillars have something to eat. And we have late bloomers like asters and goldenrod so that the butterflies, the late butterflies have something to eat. Then we're also going to benefit others. This is a picture of a fading common milkweed bloom from a number of years ago. When we first got started on this project, I was really excited to take this picture, and I sent it to Dr. Talamy, and I said, how many insects am I looking at this one flower? Because I see a beetle up here, I see a wasp here, I see another beetle here, I see an ant here, I see someone's face here, I see someone else's face here, I see someone's abdomen here. There's all these insects there. And he sent me back a list of 11 Latin names of genera, which is plural for genus, and none of them are monarch butterflies. So 11 other species are benefiting from this fading bloom of a plant that was planted just for monarch butterflies. So this is the idea of all of the benefits that we can have, and calling this something like a keystone species. And so this is the critical part of the Bringing Nature Home initiative, and the critical part of making this a bird conservation effort. So I mentioned at the beginning that this is all about breeding birds. This is the food that is most critical for breeding birds, is caterpillars, the larval phase of the life cycle of butterflies and moths. The reason all these birds are coming to Maine is because Maine has all of these native host plants that host many, many species of caterpillars. And the birds know that June in Maine is the perfect time and the perfect place to get the food that their nestlings are going to need. Even bird species like black-capped chickadees and tufted titmice and northern cardinals, and these species that we see all over our bird feeders, these species, they're going to switch over to insects while they're nesting, because their babies while they're in nests, they can't eat seeds. They can't process those yet with their developing bills. They need squishy little protein pills like these guys, soft food that's going to help them grow and develop muscle and mass really quickly, because some of them are going to have to migrate. So this is where, if you just focus on pollinators and all those pretty flowers that are feeding all the adults, then you're going to miss the point. You might miss the point, because if you don't have host plants for those pollinators, if you don't have the plants that they historically have laid their eggs on, then you're only feeding the grown-ups. That's kind of like only having bird feeders and expecting black-capped chickadees to be able to make babies with your black oil sunflower seeds. They can't do it. That's only what the adults need. And so making sure our choices in the garden are incorporating the native plants as well, and the pollinator host plants. And I'll tell you how to do that. And we don't have to work too hard to put these plants back. When we figure out what the host plants are, and again, I'll teach you how to do that, and how Maine Audubon can help. These plants are already here. They're already fighting to be here. They're already surviving. They're already cohabitating these places. This is common milkweed on Woodford Street in Portland, where I live. I assure you, this plant has never had a cooperative extension soil test at this site. It's never had a soil amendment at this site. No one has ever weeded the competition and trimmed back things to enable this plant to fully leaf out. This plant just got left alone and it figured out how to do its thing. And in the course of doing its thing, it fed all these monarchs and a bunch of other critters like the 11 species I showed you pictures of. And it belongs here. This is its place, right? And I get that you can't do common milkweed and you don't want to plant that in your tiny little yard because it does spread. But with a little bit of digging, we can find other species of that same genus, the milkweed genus, Asclepias, that don't spread via underground rhizomes, those underground stems. And they don't go crazy and they don't want to take over the whole meadow or your whole backyard. Species like this swamp milkweed, Asclepias incarnata, which is not an aggressive spreader. It grows like an upright hourglass, just like a lot of your perennials. It's a great cut flower. It checks all of the boxes, and it's just as valuable to monarch butterflies and a lot of other insects as that weed, common milkweed, right? Butterfly weed, the orange version, is another great species of milkweed that's just as native to Maine, just as beneficial to monarchs and other wildlife, and is not an aggressive spreader. It's a tough to grow species, but once it establishes, it wants to stay put. It wants to stay in a clump, and it wants to develop that big, deep taproot. And so that's the trick, is finding the ecological benefits, right? The ecological function, and then figuring out how to get those same benefits in a plant that also performs well in the landscape functions, right? And if it connects to people and Wabanaki culture or some other social or historical context, even better, right? And there are those plants too. And so this is really about the birds, right? This is about the birds like this unfamiliar bird. Some of you are like, is that a black-capped chickadee? No, it's not. It's not a nuthatch either, although it kind of acts like it sometimes. This is a black-poll warbler. This is a male black-poll warbler. This is the black-poll warbler's migration map, and this is another this is more evidence of why this is so important for us in Cumberland, Maine, more important than I dare say than people in Kansas City, where I grew up, or other places, especially for species like the black-poll warbler, right? So the winter, blue is the winter breeding grounds. So pretty soon now, the days are going to get longer and insect hatches are going to ramp up. And the whole population of black-poll warblers is going to work its way across the Caribbean, and they're going to disperse across North America. And they're headed to this orange area, which is its breeding range, the boreal forest of Canada. So you can see not a little bit of boreal forest stretching down into Maine, less and less as we speak, but mostly this is a bird that's going to breed north of us, right? And it's going to do its thing. And in the course of making babies in the boreal forest, 75 feet off the up in the high canopy, it needs big mature forest too. It's going to work its way. Once those families are fledged and those babies are ready to go, the whole species is going to work its way south and east. And when the time is right, in September or early October, those birds are going to leap off the coast. They're going to leapfrog across Casco Bay, and they're going to take a flight that's going to take them anywhere from 48 hours to, in some cases, 14 days of straight flying. And they are doing that to avoid predators and competition. They're not going to eat. They're not going to stop on fishing boats or buoys. They're going to go fly all the way to their winter breeding ground. And they have to do that in one trip, and they're going to have a 2/3 shift switch change in their body weight in the course of that flight. They're going to put an extra third of body weight, muscle and fat on, getting ready for the journey. And they're going to be a third underweight by the time they hit here. So a 2/3 swing. And so that's why it's so important that Maine landscapes are full of insects like caterpillars up in the high tree, and there's lots of tall trees so that the black-polled warbler can gear up for its migration pattern. So if we look around in our landscapes in September or October, and we see this gal, and we know that this is a female black-polled warbler, this is a really important, that makes this a really important picture. Someone capturing this bird, which is a very common bird. This is not a hard picture to get if you know your birds and you have a nice camera. But the importance of a female black-polled warbler sitting on someone's lattice work, which is definitely not in the high canopy. Nobody puts lattice up there. But this bird came down in order to benefit from the insects that it found in good habitat. It grabbed an insect, you know, again, good camera. This is happening all around us. The only thing unique here is a good camera happened to be there. She'll smile for that photographer and tell you how psyched she is that she found insects. And then again, you think back to that migration map and you know what she's about to do. She's only in Portland in September for one thing, and that's to get ready to make that big, huge flight to the Amazon. And so that's really important. So that's what this project is really about for us. It's about species of plants that are historically native here and belong here. And that belonging is not just historical. The belonging makes it connected to all this other ecology and ecosystem services. That's where the plant derives belonging, is from what it's doing for the other species and the other taxa around it. Once we get these plants, we have to take care of them in a way that maximizes their benefits. I know in Portland, where I live, you have to get your leaf bags out on the curb while asters and blooming and goldenrod are still blooming in the landscape. If I were to get all that stuff hauled off in time by the city for free, I would have to cut all that stuff right when it's blooming and doing all of its goodness for monarchs and others. And then I would also lose the benefit of those plants going to seed after they bloom and serving as a food source for all the migrating sparrows and other birds that need those seeds in the landscape. So we have to manage things in a way that enables the benefit. And then the other thing we have to maintain that the horticulture industry does not do effectively is maintain genetic diversity and sustainability. We can't just clone plants. Just because we can make 100,000 individuals from one cutting of one plant doesn't mean we should, and doesn't mean those 100,000 plants are going to contribute to a more resilient landscape once they're in there. So we have to pay attention to the native plants that are still here and collecting those seeds responsibly. And we probably are not going to be able to just let those seeds blow around and cross our fingers that milkweed works. We're probably going to have to nurture it and sow it ourselves. And we get to use the same nature that happens out there. All milkweed needs is to find soil and to get covered with snow and go through freeze thaw over the course of Maine winter, and it will germinate. That's how it does in nature. And we can replicate that germination in a pot. And we can grow species like butterfly weed, the orange blooming one, in pots. The cage there is not to keep the plant in, it's to keep the gray squirrels out while the plant is still fragile. And we can get those beautiful blooms and all of that wonderful benefit in our garden and still have a part in replacing, you don't try to read this. This is a web page for butterfly weed, which you just saw being naturally propagated on my deck in Portland. But this species also happens to be state listed as potentially extirpated in Maine. So the last wild occurring population in Maine was recorded in Old Orchard Beach in 1985. And there hasn't been a naturally occurring population anywhere in Maine found since. But the monarchs that are coming here didn't get that memo, and they will still use butterfly weed and depend on butterfly weed, whether they find it in the wild or if they find it in your garden. They still need it and they still deserve to have it. And so this is the website. I'm happy to share all these with the websites with Kelly after this. But this is the National Wildlife Federation website, their native plant finder. And this is a website that you can enter your zip code if you're trying to figure out what are the genera, the plural of genus, what are the plants that I should be growing in my zip code, and what species of butterflies and moths have they hosted historically? Because then you can have fun just hosting species that you want to host, like monarch butterflies that aren't actually great bird food, or you can also seek species that are going to make that are potentially host a whole lot of caterpillars, a whole lot of species, so that your birds are more likely to find something, right? And that website lets you, so that was the zip code 04101, which you can see up there. And these are the species. The top is flowers and grasses. And if you scroll down on the page, it'll do trees and shrubs for you. And if you were to click, so if you go in here and you think, native sunflower, Helianthus genus, I think I'll click on that. Then it gives you the profile. It lists some of the species that are native, although these aren't the greatest lists I found as a plants person. But that's where you'll see, so this genus, if you grow this genus in 04101, historically, that genus of plants has hosted, there are records of it having hosted 60 species of butterflies and moths as a caterpillar host plant. That makes this one of the best families of plants that you can grow if you want baby birds to find food in your yard, or rather their parents to find the food and to bring it to them where they're nesting. And so this is how we restore bird habitat without restoring the forest, which I know many of you can't do. You can't restore the forest to the library landscape. What you can do is have a library landscape and all the beds and the gardens and the trees to be the best host plants that you can possibly find, so that you know that you're making baby bird food without referring to the forest. So I'm going to wrap up on that. But before I do, I want to share a couple of websites or resources that I'm happy to talk more about. The Maine Native Plant Finder is, I'll show you that website in a second, but that is Maine Audubon's new website for the plants that are great host plants, that are historically significant for one reason or another. And most importantly, you can buy and grow pretty easily, thanks to Maine Audubon and more nurseries that are growing native plants. And so MaineNativePlants.org is the website where you can see that catalog of about 80 or 100 great native plants to grow. Wild Seed Project is a great website. Again, another Maine-based organization. Their specialty is promoting these plants, same kind of plants, but also encouraging people to grow them from seed so that we have the genetic diversity. So you can buy a packet of seed from Wild Seed Project, and usually the best time to do that is in the fall, because the plants that go to seed in Maine like a winter outdoors in order to germinate. So Wild Seed Project is a great one. Native Plant Trust is a great regional plant conservation network that they used to be called New England Wildflower Society, which I know is a name many people are still familiar, but Native Plant Trust is the same organization, new name. And then a couple other resources that are smaller. How do I know if things are native? And a little nursery in Alfred that I like to give a plug because he just did a new website. And then my last slide, and then I promise I'll hit the Q&A button. Maine Audubon is in the business of promoting these plants, but also until more nurseries are selling them, we are selling native plants. Our big native plant sale and festival, our in-person event, we're excited to have that back after 2 years. That will be June 11th at Gilsland Farm. but have no fear. We are also going to continue our pandemic pivot, which has been wonderful. We sell plants online. You can shop and purchase online and schedule a curbside pickup at Gilson Farm. And that will go on, that will start in June and goes all the way through September, October, where you can, and we're constantly updating the inventory. And so you can keep checking back and you can find those plants and you don't have to deal with the madness of the plant sale, the in-person sale. So with that, I'm gonna stop sharing if I can figure out where I am here and turn it over for questions.
Thank you, Eric. That was very informative. So I have a question for you.
Yes, please.
So let's just say, for example, I have a garden that has many non-native plants. Is your recommendation to replace those? Leave them be? What?
Yeah, so depending on what you're trying to do, those plants sound, I'm not sure, because not all, there are certainly exotic plants that are having some benefit. Apple trees, for example, are an exotic plant. They're not native to Maine. Don't get rid of any apple trees. The birds need them. The other critters need them. But exotic plants, if they are not serving as pollinator forage, or more importantly, as larval host plants, I would characterize that as lost real estate for Maine birds. That has the ecological equivalent of your driveway, right? They're pretty, it serves your utility, but it's not really doing anything for wildlife. And so I don't want you to start hating all your beloved lilacs and forsythia and all those plants, even though they don't do very much for wildlife and habitat. But I would encourage people that are dealing with struggling plants, that are sick of these plants, you know, that as soon as you're thinking about replacing a plant this summer, that you think of that as an opportunity to put something more useful into that spot. And so yes and no. I think whatever plants are going to get you into your garden, you need to grow, because that's really important for all of us. But while you're there, take stock of the plants that you're seeing caterpillars on, that you're seeing pollinators on. Are you seeing native pollinators or just honeybees? All of those questions, the wildlife will tell you whether that's benefiting you or not. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. I'm also wondering if you can, if you can just talk a little bit, because time is an issue, but about things like brown-tailed moth or even invasive plants.
Yeah,
I don't know, maybe that's too much of a broad topic to give you.
It's too broad, but just in a nutshell, the problem with invasive plants is exaggerated the problems I just described. So the lost real estate, you know, of an exotic plant, like a lilac doesn't do anything, but it doesn't go anywhere either, right? Having that non-benefit spread invasively and out competing other plants, that's a problem, because that plant is taking real estate now. Okay. It's not just lost real estate. And then I realize it's tough to promote caterpillars in a world where we have brown-tailed moth and other species that are running amok. That's not the ecology that I'm trying to promote. Native ecology has its own checks and balances, and you don't deal with these outbreaks and things like that. Brown-tailed moth, one of the problems is there's no natural predators in this landscape that is completely new to them. They are kids in candy stores and there's no grown-ups, and they just get to do their thing, and no native species would completely defoliate its host tree. That's called ecological suicide, right? You don't want to do that to your mother, right? And so brown-tailed moth, this is evidence that these plants, things are out of whack. So that's a whole different management technique. Yeah. So big topic for sure.
Okay, we have a question from Nancy, who is wondering what was the name of the milkweed plant that you recommended?
My top recommendation across the board, my favorite native plant species, the first one everybody should go out and buy and grow, swamp milkweed, or if you're offended by the word swamp, I've also heard it referred to as rose milkweed, which is much more palatable. The species name, which is more important to me, the botanical name, because there's no mix up there, Asclepias incarnata. That's rose or swamp milkweed. That's the well-behaved one, grows in a variety of soil, variety of different sun conditions, really easy to grow, and it'll get you your first fix. So that's one. I see another question about the other species I mentioned, butterfly weed, which is, it should be among your first, but don't give up if it doesn't work. Butterfly weed can be hard to establish primarily because people give up on it too easily. Butterfly weed goes by has the botanical name Asclepias tuberosa because it has a really thick taproot. And that takes a couple or few years to develop, and you don't see much of the plant up top. And this is why people give up on it. Butterfly weed is a great plant. If you put it in, you forget about it. And 3 years later, you're amazed that this butterfly weed sprouted up because you forgot about it. So Maine Audubon does sell both of those species. Wild Seed Project sells seeds of both of those species, so they are easier to get a hold. So everybody start with Asclepias incarnata and take a stab at butterfly weed if you're feeling brave and you have deep soil and that sort of thing.
So Emily has a question. What do you think of lawns, and do you have any thoughts on alternatives for households with families who want to use our yards?
Yeah, so there are eco lawns I've seen a little bit, and I've seen some lawn alternatives. If you're going to use a lawn for a lawn, there's probably no alternative that's better than the exotic, horticulture for that purpose. But your lawn will never be wildlife ecologically beneficial. Again, it's the best you can do with your lawn. If it's going to be a useful lawn for soccer and hosting, people on and things like that, the best you can do is no harm with that lawn. So don't use synthetic pesticides. I recommend beneficial nematodes as a way to deal with grubs and things like that. That's a whole other separate thing of green lawn maintenance, but that's lost real estate for wildlife benefit. Don't be fooled by the fact that you see robins in there pulling up earthworms. That's another exotic species, and those sorts of things. But lawn is admittedly a practical reality for a lot of landscapes. So what I would instead encourage is find places where you can take some stuff back. I look forward to my kids not using our entire backyard because I intend to restore some little mini meadow back there when it's not being trampled on, and those sorts of things. Cutting in the edges, right? Instead of, does your lawn go all the way to the fence? Or could you have a bed, along the fence there in which you could have some great native species kind of hemming in your lawn? You can still kick a soccer ball. The plants aren't going to die if they get rolled over, but you can add some benefits in there. So less lawn is definitely better for wildlife, no question, but it's not necessarily better for, high school complexes and things like that. I get it.
Thank you. Judith asks, do you recommend against bird feeders?
So bird feeders are incredible for people. They're not really a thing for birds. The best studies, the best estimates I've seen as even prolific feeder birds like black-capped chickadees, like invasive house sparrows, they are only getting between 12 to 17% of their food from those feeders. So even those birds are still getting in the 80% of natural food any time of year. So they're not super critical. What they are important for is they're like a polling place in the election. That's the place where you take attendance, right? You get the birds, that's the place where you get the birds up there out in plain view, and you can keep track of who's around, what season it is, are things happening early this year, all those other benefits, and having fun and getting to know who's using your yard for that other 80%, right? many of us would never see a chickadee if we didn't see one propped up on the feeder. So it's important to know who's there, because then that can guide my management decisions. If I have a chickadee on my feeder in March, chances are I'm going to have 2 chickadees in May, and chances are one's going to be a male and one's going to be a female, and they're going to maybe build a nest somewhere in one of these trees or cavities around me. And that's when those chickadees are going to need insects. They're not going to need my feeder, but they're going to need the insects, and so I can manage for them. So I love feeders as long as we know what they're for. They're not for conserving. You can't call feeding birds out of a plastic or metal feeder conserving birds, because you're not. You're just keeping track.
Thank you. From a question from Duncan, who is 6 years old and watching. What if you have purple loosestrife in your yard? How do you get rid of it?
Purple loosestrife is a really tough invasive species, and it is really doing a job out competing places that used to be meadow. And so that's a thing that if you just let your lawn, if you stopped mowing your lawn this year and you just let it all grow up, you would be more likely to have a plant like purple loosestrife than a plant like a New England aster, based on whose seeds are blown around. So my recommendation is for all invasive species, if you can dig it up, that's the best way to get rid of it, and dig it up whenever you can, whenever you see it, get the roots out of there. The other easier way to do it over a longer period of time is purple loosestrife is beautiful when it blooms. It raises its hand. It says, here I am, I'm over here. And that's a perfect time for you to go over there with your pruners and cut off every single one of those flowers before they go to seed. Because if you if you cut them down when they bloom, then they will never produce seeds, and they will just, you will just be slowly, the adults that are there, the adult plants will slowly live out their lifetime and never make babies. So cut those flowers. That's a great way. Don't cut New England aster flowers. Let them go to seed, but cut all the invasive species as soon as they flower. And that's how we'll knock back those populations.
It takes paying attention and diligence.
Yes. We have a purple loosestrife party every year, sponsored by Holy Donut at Gilsland Farm. It's not actually sponsored by them. We buy the donuts, but we buy everybody Holy Donut, and we say, we're going to be here, but you have to do 2 hours of cutting purple loosestrife. We all put our boots on, we go out on the meadows, and we cut all the flowers down.
So there's your answer, Duncan. Have a party.
Holy Donut.
Purple loosestrife party. A question from Lala. What do I do about predators killing my monarch caterpillars? Are milkweed bugs predators? Those black and orange speckled bugs, I think she's referring to.
Yeah. Yeah, so no, so the predators, there are no known predators of monarch caterpillars, but I know stuff eat them in my yard in particular. So monarch caterpillars don't get their trick. I know people have talked about toxicity and monarch butterflies are toxic and that's why birds don't eat them. That's not really the thing for monarchs in Maine. That might be a thing, but the better defense mechanism for monarch caterpillars in Maine is the timing, the fact that they are in their larval phase after many birds have left the nest and they've already switched back to grains or they've migrated or moved along. But whatever eats monarch caterpillars could be characterized as part of the food web and something that needs that food source at that time. There are the milkweed beetles are another insect that is hosted by milkweed plants. I believe they can cohabitate with monarchs. They also use the beetles that you're seeing are I believe laying eggs, and their larval phase of the beetles uses the I'm not as familiar with that life cycle, but I believe that larva also uses the plant. So I think when we see milkweed and we see lots of beetles and lots of activities, that's generally a good thing. I also know I get a lot of calls in the summer about aphids. the oleander aphids, the orange one. You saw from my photos, there were aphids all over some of the plants. Some years are better than others. You can wash them. The monarchs don't care about them. They seem to work fine there. One thing I won't recommend is, and I have had experience with this, I do not recommend using ladybugs to treat aphids if you are managing for monarch butterflies, because I know ladybugs are a predator of monarch eggs and lots of other eggs as well. That is not a problem for normal populations, natural populations of ladybugs. But when you buy a whole container of 200 of them and you put them on one plant, then you're not going to have any monarch eggs from that. So that's one known predator that I'd stay away from.
Interesting. I didn't know that about ladybugs.
So don't go kill ladybugs, but don't buy a container of 300 of them if you have monarch eggs.
Right. We still love ladybugs, but
Yeah.
not in the extreme. Gotcha. Jane asks, if you have contaminated soils from lead, how should one think about planting?
So lead is a huge problem where I live in Portland. It is, the entire landscape is contaminated. Lead is only a problem that I pay attention to for the food that I'm gonna feed my kids. I don't worry about lead at all for growing food for monarch butterflies and for baby birds and things like that. I have not seen studies where that lead has built up and created the same kind of problems that our bald eagles are experiencing for lead when they're eating, carrion filled with lead shot and things like that. I'm not aware of any evidence of that passing up the food chain. So I can't imagine a scenario where you would say, well, I can't grow tomatoes and I also can't grow baby bird food in this landscape. We should be trying that. We should be restoring those habitats. And again, that's where I would flip, especially if you were growing Swiss chard in your lawn and you found out you have lead and you don't want to do that anymore. Don't let it go to lawn. Put some native wildflowers where the chard used to go, right? You're not going to eat that anymore, but at least do something else with that landscape. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, aside from the fact that Lala would like to hire you to design her native plant garden.
She wouldn't. She doesn't know. She just thinks so. Yeah. It'll look like this back here. It'll look messy and wild. Yeah. There are lots of great designers. I will say, sorry to interrupt, but Lala, I'll save you the trouble. All landscape designers know how to do this. The reason they don't is because hardly any clients demand it. You find someone that your neighbor really liked working with and call that person, and you're going to really like working with them. And you say, I want someone who's going to help me with a design that integrates natives and is not going to talk me out of it, because this is really important to me. I want someone who can get to how, not if. And any landscape designer, when it's a job on the line, is going to say, I can work with native plants. I want the job, right? That's who you want to work with.
Excellent. Thank you. Well said. Eric, thank you very much. This was fabulous. And your enthusiasm is infectious, and I appreciate that. So thank you very much. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. I do want to just give a shout out to the Friends of Prince Memorial Library. They are the people who so generously can sponsor programs like this. So we thank them always for all of our programming. So thanks, Eric. Thank you, everybody, and good night.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great night. Thanks for having me, Kelly.
Thanks.